market, risk and opportunities in regulation. And for that kind of conversation, it's hard to think of anyone better to have to engage in sort of what the status is and where the challenge is, and to get a really full perspective from Brad Garlinghouse, the CEO of Ripple. Brad, thanks so much for joining DC FinTech Week. You are now a veteran of this program, and you've been here many times, and thank you once again for joining us.
And thank you, Chris. I will say, for everyone's benefit, I said to Chris backstage a moment ago, the fact that he does this event, I think, is super important for the industry. And so we all owe you a debt of gratitude. So thank you.
All right. Well, I guess, everybody, first of all, is going to want to know, I actually, have had conversations about the importance of Twitter in crypto conversations in general. And but there are limitations in terms of what information is being shared and the speed at which the different sort of going backs and forths go. But when it comes to the litigation between the SEC and Ripple, it seems like it moves around pretty quickly, and things simply are changing. Maybe can you give us a background as to sort of where things stand and what is the posture when it comes to that litigation right now?
Absolutely. So in some ways, it actually, as you know, as a student of and teacher of the law, in some ways, for the pace of activity actually has been for federal courts pretty fast. On the other hand, Ripple would like it to go faster. Our point of view has been, given that the SEC sued Ripple on the day before Jay Clayton left office, clearly they were in a hurry. And even just, recently they have been seeking delays, which is, as you certainly know, unusual for a plaintiff to be the one looking for delays versus the defendant. So, look, there's been a lot of progress made there. The fact discovery part of the litigation has completed. Now we're in what's called expert discovery. The court just granted the SEC a delay of expert discovery into January, which again we find frustrating. Just like, hey, let's make progress here. But look, Twitter has had an interesting, in my judgment, role that I have never seen before, because there are some amazing people out there, which I'll just generically call the Twitter sleuths. And they have found, videos of, people at the SEC, whether it's Jay Clayton or Director Bill Hinman, or more recently, the new chair, Gary Gensler, whom you had on this morning, saying things like, hey, that the status isn't clear, or saying, hey, 75% of the market of crypto is not securities. This is a quote from Gary Gensler, that now saying, well, no, he views most of it, if not all of it, as a security. So I think it's clear that the market has not had clarity. I think it's that is certain. You and I talked very briefly back, kind of the proverbial backstage, and almost 2 years ago to the day, you had Jay Clayton on stage at DC FinTech Week in person, one of the last events. And I was on about an hour later. So I was in the room and someone asked Jay Clayton, hey, what's the status of XRP? Is it a security? And he didn't answer the question. More recently, Gary Gensler won't answer the question, is ETH a security? And look, if these laws are so clear, then let's just say the answer to those questions. If they're not clear, let's say they're not clear, and let's make them more clear.
Yeah, I think certainly as a law professor, it's teaching securities law has changed quite a good deal. The significance of talking about a bunch of oranges and orange groves in Florida, has certainly taken a twist in the last couple of years. And there is, and I did ask Chairman Gensler earlier today, what is it about crypto that is a flashpoint? Because whether or not you're a supporter, whether or not you're a detractor, there's a lot of energy behind it. And the question is, how much of that is the technology, the complexity. Certainly, there's a lot of swagger in the industry, but how much of also is the regulatory response, and how much does that create its own kind of a function, and that's also clearly a question. Interesting perspective, right? Because Ripple is certainly not the only company that's been in the crosshairs of different kinds of SEC actions, or frankly even as recently CFTC actions. and you've seen companies face their own form of regulatory uncertainty. That's a conversation you and I now, I guess, are having several years on. What comes to mind when you see certain kinds of questions like the ones you just mentioned, sort of percolating from time to time? What's your sense of the stakes when you certainly do see more enforcement actions in the space with similar kinds of postures in terms of the response to those enforcement actions?
Well, one of the things I said when the SEC sued Ripple and sued me personally last December, I said, look, this is not an attack just on Ripple. This is an attack on crypto. And I think at the time, for some people anyway, my impression was that was not totally obvious to them, that they weren't convinced of that. And I think as time has gone by, you're seeing, oh, yes, in fact, it's clear that the SEC, the United States SEC, is taking a pretty aggressive posture towards crypto. And whether most recently, obviously, some I guess I'll just generically call it drama with Coinbase and their Lend product. But the SEC has told responsible actors, "Hey, come in and talk to me. Come in and have a conversation." As an observer, it feels like responsible actors go in and meet with them, and they use that as lead generation for their enforcement team to, "Hey, let's now go and let's try to figure out the policy through enforcement." So again, from my point of view, it's been this is important for the whole industry, and it'll take a little while to play out. But I think it's trending in I think good direction to provide that clarity. One other thing that you brought up that I just want to touch on, I think you got to step back a little bit and say, what's the end game? There's a narrative that you hear. I think Chair Gensler has used it, certainly, that this is the Wild West. The U.S. crypto industry is regulated today. You referenced the CFTC. The last speaker who was speaking was talking about the market manipulation and the role the CFTC plays. So the idea that this is an unregulated industry in the United States is a farce. That's just not the case. And so for part of me, it's like, what is the end game the SEC has in mind? And so I go to kind of first principles. The SEC's mission statement, this is on their website. The mission statement, first sentence, is about protecting consumers. Okay. Now, in the case of the Ripple lawsuit, you have nearly, I'm told, 50,000 US people who hold XRP who are trying to sue the SEC for protecting them, And it's kind of like, well, wait a minute. If the mission, let's go to first principles. If the mission is about protecting consumers, about ensuring orderly markets, how are we ensuring orderly markets when we can't? 2 years ago, if the SEC thought XRP was a security 2 years ago, Chair Clayton answered the question, and then we know, and then we can act within that construct. But then to say to Ripple and even to me personally, hey, we've now decided we think XRP might be a security, and everything you did in 2015 and 2014 and 2016, sorry, that wasn't in order, but that doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, the legal process, and there are lots of ways to make laws and rulings, and this will obviously work itself out one way or another. Well, one question I did ask Chair Gensler, and I think I'd be curious to get your view on this, in part because I've asked you it before, and now with a year of hindsight, it could be a little bit more interesting to get to return to that question. And that was this question that I asked earlier this morning on digital transformation and sort of the global nature of the internet and obviously crypto markets. And, whether or not, especially in a post-pandemic world and the shift to digital, to what degree sort of international competition, sort of the competitive posture of the United States and frankly, even the mobility of the industry, how much does that weigh on his mind or not? I mean, because certainly questions about global competition have been around for a very, very, very long time. And, he had made the correct observation that, the digital economy has been around for a while. But, when you think about let's call it the U.S. regulatory posture, what does the global dimension add to this, in your view, that's different from, let's call it the standard sort of talking point on the fact that we live in a global market? Is there something about crypto and crypto markets and the regulatory posture that really does make this a salient issue for consideration?
I think it's a really important question. And I say that, you're obviously in Washington. I think, many in the crypto industry probably need to spend more time in Washington and providing open transparency and education. Look, I think if I go back to my first kind of introduction, professionally getting involved in technology, in the 90s, I moved to Silicon Valley in 1997. And, so I reflect on that time period and why so much capital and so much entrepreneurship was happening. And one of the reasons is because the US government provided clarity. The US government provided certainty so that investors, so that entrepreneurs could build companies in the internet space with clarity about what the rules of the road were. And that obviously put the United States, not just economically in terms of value creation, you got Amazon, you got Facebook, you can debate some of the policy things they're dealing with now, but there's been massive value creation to US participants. But even on a geopolitical basis, has it been useful that the internet as we know it in many ways has been grounded kind of, in the US, it was certainly a pioneer and leader. I believe we're dealing with a next generation platform that is analogous to the internet as we know it today. And if the US doesn't take a leadership role, which frankly, the US so far has clearly been a laggard, that we run the risk here in the United States that global economies have some of those benefits over the next 10, 20 years. So countries like the UK have done the hard work to create what they call the Token Taxonomy Act. It provided the clarity and kind of here's how they're going to segment different tokens and how that taxonomy will affect regulation. Singapore, Japan, these aren't, I'm not talking about kind of small countries with small economies. These are G20 markets, Switzerland. These are all countries that have provided clarity and certainty. They've done the work. They're not trying to do the work through enforcement actions and trying to create policy through enforcement. They're saying, look, let's step back, let's create a construct, and let's make sure we're doing the right thing to help that economy. And so, look, here in the United States, I think we run the risk. We need to make sure we don't paint all crypto with one broad brush. There's not going to be one winner, despite the SEC's kind of, hey, we're going to anoint, winners and losers a little bit.
Yeah.
I'll let you jump in. Sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, you just sort of obviously that last line brings up an entirely sort of different vector of questions. But I just want to close the loop on the international question really, really quickly. China hasn't exactly been very friendly to crypto either, and certainly that there's been really an uptick in enforcement there. When you think about sort of the mobility of capital and crypto and opportunities, and you listed a number of interesting jurisdictions, how much though does the entry of China and its posture sort of change that formula of potential outcomes?
It's a good question. Look, Chris, you've been following crypto closely for a bunch of years. And so you and I both have seen the kind of, I was going to say pendulum. That's probably not the right comparison. But, at least in my experience over the last, 7 or 8 years that I've been paying close attention to crypto, China has at least on 3 occasions taken a aggressive, anti-crypto stance. And then that has kind of moderated over time. And look, I think governments are generally feeling the pressure of, hey, we need to act. El Salvador on the other side of the spectrum, making Bitcoin legal tender. But, I think it's very clear an all-out ban and what we're seeing in some countries remains a kind of hostile posture. But, that doesn't make a ton of sense, in my opinion, in the long run. If you again step back to the macro perspective, over the last 7 years, the trend line for crypto and friendliness from governments is very positive, right? The U.S. may not be a leader, but certainly if you look at the macro, the fact that 7 years ago this was viewed as very fringe and really primarily there to serve maybe the Silk Roads of the world, that's not where we are now. You have real companies in many different industries identifying and understanding how blockchain can actually reduce transaction costs, from a speed point of view, from a cost point of view. And, where Ripple has started very much focused on that around cross-border payments, there's going to be a lot of winners, just as there was with the internet in the kind of 90s and 2000s. Like, there's going to be a lot of winners here.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point in terms of, a lot of times, even though we are obviously in a world of network economics, even in a world of network economics, you can have more than one or two winners. Yeah, the question is obviously how many and the degree of competition between them. You had obviously sort of opened up in that last little comment there. This interesting question of sort of picking winners and losers, and it's just too irresistible for me to sort of ask a little bit about. I suppose, and if you're going to ask Chairman Gensler right now, and he said so publicly before, going back to those wonderful Orange Grove cases, he'll say, hey, look, we have an existing regulatory perimeter, and we have it based off of the facts and circumstances of the Howey test, and the Howey test will point us in the right direction as to whether or not any particular crypto asset is a security or not. Now that kind of posture by definition sort of says, look, this it's pretty objective test here. I mean, certainly under securities law, it's called an objective test in many ways. So hey, that's how it is, and that's the outcome. When you come to sort of then your view on winners and losers, and we have a lot of also even students who are listening as well as everybody else. What does that mean sort of in practice? Like, where are you getting this particular sort of argument about sort of almost outcomes based regulation?
Yeah. So, look, first of all, I will say, and I compliment you and your interview of Chair Gensler this morning. Chair Gensler said this morning that he does think there's, laws that need to be updated to keep up with 21st, I think he said 20th and 21st century technologies. I hope we're not focused on 20th century technology, because that's 21 years ago. But, look, he did acknowledge, I think, that there is a need for regulations and laws to keep up. Of course, I think the idea that the Howey test, this test you're referring about, Orange Groves from, I think it was 1940 something. I don't remember the exact date. You may know as a professor. You should teach me some things. But look, the idea that an Orange Grove Supreme Court case from 80 years ago is the right framework to assess if digital assets are securities feels challenged to me, and I think it's the reason why 2 years ago, almost to the day, Jay Clayton couldn't answer the question, is XRP a security? And the reason why Chair Gensler is not answering the question, is ETH a security? So I think there is a need to do that. I think you are very familiar and have been, I think, a champion of some of the opportunities through Congress to make some of those changes. But to the other part of your question, which I think is the meat of the matter, I fundamentally do not believe it's the role of government to pick winners and losers. And there is the idea that the United States government, particularly in a very climate aware, climate forward administration, hasn't helped pick winners in the United States ecosystem around crypto is crazy. First, obviously, even today, Chair Gensler is taking he appears to be saying, well, Bitcoin is different from everybody else. And then obviously, Director Hinman under Chairman Clayton, said that ETH had a free pass. The interesting thing to observe is that it is affecting the market, right? Within the last few years, XRP was the second most valuable digital asset. As it became clear the SEC had given the hall pass to ETH, ETH obviously has, kind of exploded in that clarity has helped. Right now, the question is it now clarity when Gensler seems to maybe be backing away from that, not answering some of the same questions? I don't know, but I just fundamentally think we should let market forces determine winners and losers, not regulation by enforcement as what we're seeing today.
Yeah, so getting out of like the securities versus this very stringent box of securities law for a moment, and just to transition for a moment, when you think about the kinds of changes that we're going to be seeing in the ecosystem, regardless really as to the specific regulatory box, you see issues that talking about changes in consensus mechanisms, governance, and even sort of the services, right, that are being introduced into the ecosystem right now over at Ripple. Where are you guys sort of putting your energy, and what do you think are some of the drivers that are going to maybe cause certain elements of that very large ecosystem-wide sort of self-evaluation progression? What kinds of areas of emphasis are you guys really putting your energy into right now?
So there's two parts of Ripple, and this has certainly evolved since you and I last spoke publicly in the last couple years, but there's really two parts. There's the part that I think is Ripple's the most known for, and we have a business unit called RippleNet. RippleNet is run by a very talented guy named Ashish Birla, and we think about the primary metric of success is transactions. How many payment transactions happen per quarter? Despite the headwinds from the SEC, we have had a record year on a ton of different dimensions. Here in the United States, we have signed exactly 0 new customers. And we've lost customers here in the United States because they're like, hey, look, until the United States regulatory framework is clear, we need to lean out. And that puts headwinds. But despite that, we've grown, the last quarter, we grew 33% quarter over quarter. So that's, we feel very good about that. Actually, one of the parts of our technology that I think, Chris, you're familiar with, on-demand liquidity, which is where we use XRP to shuttle liquidity for financial institutions, that grew 130% quarter over quarter. So demand for the solutions we have is high. That growth all coming from outside the United States. And in fact, it's making up for contraction, having lost a couple of customers here in the United States. So recently we announced a new quarter with Japanese yen as the origination point, and a big remittance customer there. But you certainly know this stuff well. The cost to move money, particularly overseas, and particularly, by the way, the remittance segment, this is a population that is, the least equipped to, have what I'll call high penalties of the result of the infrastructure and how it works today. And as we remove that friction, costs are coming down, and that's good for the companies involved, and it's good ultimately for those end consumers in those most at-risk populations that depend upon those remittance corridors.
Yeah, and to carry that out, because, and as a sort of a bridge sort of currency idea that was always sort of introduced for XRP in particular, to what degree does, let's call it, the regulatory cloud, not just for Ripple, but just overall in terms of the direction of policy making? We had an earlier sort of panel of crypto investors on, and one of the questions was, because we started today off with this great pitch book sort of assessment of venture capital and money going into either tokens or infrastructure, et cetera. And one of the questions was, well, to what degree is that regulatory cloud or potential regulatory action sort of impairing or making it harder to price any particular risk or opportunity in the sector? From your vantage point, when you watch and you talk to your international partners, what are you hearing from them, not just about obviously the lawsuit, but just writ large in terms of their impact on the overall sort of crypto space in the U.S.?
When you talk to, and I'll use an example, you talk to a Japanese financial institution, whether they're in payments or banking, they look at the Japanese laws. Japanese laws have been clear and they're certain, and so that we've signed a bunch of customers. When you look at a market like in the Middle East, UAE, the laws are clear. If you're a non-U.S. actor, you look at what the SEC is saying, and you're like, well, that's super confusing because the governments in the UK have called it a virtual currency or a utility token. And the irony, to some degree, as a U.S. citizen and U.S. company, the only country on the planet that thinks XRP is a security or could be a security is the United States. So, the good news for us has been, outside the United States, things are going well. The business is growing. We are applying energy into, what I'll describe as just other use cases. The XRP ledger, as you know, does work differently than the Bitcoin blockchain. or in terms of proof of work, as opposed to a consensus mechanism. And that has made it extremely efficient and low cost and fast as compared to other blockchains. And we think there's a lot of other use cases. And so we have another business unit called Ripple X, and the energy, pun intended here, around the energy consumption is all about how do we look at whether it's building internally. We announced a creator fund, a $250 million fund that is working with other parts of the XRP ecosystem, and we'll continue to do things like that because we think it is such a unique and almost comparatively almost magical blockchain in terms of its speed and efficiency.
So again, one of the sort of these kinds of conversations are really interesting because we can always sort of check back over the years. One of the questions is even beyond the securities law world. I mean, for obvious reasons, that's a focus. That's where a lot of people are thinking about. But when you look at the evolution of the regulatory environment, and you look at a company like Ripple, and you look at the crypto ecosystem writ large, outside of the securities law world, and you're thinking, either about the banking, we have a lot of conversation nowadays about banking and banking regulation and banking laws, as well as what's going on with our commodities regulators and money transmission. Are there areas there where you're seeing either opportunity or maybe underinvestment of attention as compared to, say, securities law land? I mean, like, a crypto company, like any financial services company, there are lots of different things you have to be aware of. Are there any other sectors where you're looking at and you're thinking, here's either an opportunity, or here's a risk, here's like, I wonder why no one's thinking about this? Is there something that kind of comes to mind, again, outside of the securities law world? Yeah,
it's a really interesting question. I'm going to be a little bit, openly dodging the question. I'll just tell you that. Okay. It's unusual to say, hey, I'm going to dodge that question, but I'm going to dodge the question a little bit. I don't want to share, here's what Ripple's thinking about and working on. I do think, however, and I'll pick on one. It's a company that I am not involved with, but I find to be super interesting. The settlement, and by the way, I know shit all about this, so I apologize in advance if I'm stepping in it, but, settlement of transactions for the real estate industry are like the costs involved, the title insurance, like it's crazy how much it costs. There's a very cool company called Proppy, which, is relatively small right now, trying to, basically tokenize real estate transactions. So if you own a home, you own an apartment, you own hypothetically a building, and you can even fractionalize the building ownership. It's just an area that I find super interesting. The amount of friction where it hasn't kept up with the efficiencies of technology, I think, is an interesting one. And I use that example because it's not one that Ripple's likely to go work on. Yeah. But look, there are a whole bunch of things. If the magic and novelty of a blockchain is to allow two parties to transact with certainty, but without trust, you don't have to have the trust. Now, today we commute trust through a central counterparty. And that central counterparty in correspondent banking is that correspondent bank. And that's where cross-border payments and Ripple's focus there. But, if you're in the real estate industry, there's a central counterparty that commutes trust of a transaction, and you buy title insurance and all these things. I think any industry that has a consequential central counterparty that's extracting tolls and slowing transactions down is at risk from how blockchain technologies can impact those industries.
All right. So I guess for the last question that I want to ask, it's again a continuation of a theme, but it's really important. And you may or may not recall, but I'd asked you once, how exactly does someone navigate uncertainty, right? Regulatory uncertainty. Now, since then, obviously the circumstances have changed dramatically, but the question is just as, or if not more, relevant. From your perch and as a leader in your company, when you look forward and you look at the next sort of big phase or cycle of activities as the company, how do you go about actually navigating those activities, and how, where are you putting your energy just in terms of management, in terms of thinking through what are the next separate opportunities for the company, either overseas or in the United States? What's that like, and how do you navigate it I'm genuinely curious.
Well, look, one thing I will say in terms of how we are applying our energy is we are growing a lot more outside the United States. And I'm not just saying in terms of customers. I'm also, our hiring has shifted. We had also a record Q3 in that we added 75 people in Q3, which is a record for us. And, a lot of those are non-US, and we will continue to hire more outside the United States. There's also the kind of corporate treasury use case. And, a lot of large multinationals and even small businesses that are, export, there's treasury use cases there that I think are interesting, and certainly some stuff that Ripple's thinking about.
Well, listen, Brad, thank you so very much. Again, you've always made time for us and for DC FinTech Week, and it's really appreciated. And it's just a very unique insight that you've always brought and that you've brought again this year. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. Be well.